Hey, if you're a journalist who uses the tool Help a Reporter Out, or Harrow, listen up. Harrow is moving to Cision's new app, Connectively. But what is Connectively? Well, imagine a place where you can quickly connect with expert sources for your next story. Connectively is a new app from Cision that's changing the way journalists, like us, content creators, experts and PRs work together. So if you're in search of credible sources, Connectively is your next stop. With just a click, you can publish your queries. These go straight to a feed where experts from loads of different backgrounds can respond, giving you their expertise. So go on, visit connectively.us to sign up for free. That's connectively.us. Connectively.us.
Hello and welcome to Freelancing for Journalists. I'm Lily, and in this series we're talking all about diversifying your income.
Hello, I'm Emma, and this week we're discussing public speaking. We've got two great guests who've done a lot of work building up this side of their freelancing career, so I can't wait to speak to them. But first of all, Lily, what's your win of the week?
Okay, I'm going to sound really smug, sorry, but my win of the week is today, because I've been uber efficient and I have got so much done. And when I look back on today, I'm just like, how was there enough hours in the day? So this morning I went to Sheffield, which is 100 miles away, on the train. On the train, I managed to finish writing up a 4,000 word feature. Went and talked for 3 hours, jumped back on the train, planned my week for next week. Then, as soon as I got off the train, I went to the gym, which is just around the corner from the train station. I had packed my shorts and vest in my work bag. I already had trainers and sports bra on that I'd worn to lecture in. You need to know all the details. So I could just literally get changed, go to the gym, walk back, answer some emails, and then jump onto this podcast. I think that's pretty good for a day's work.
Lily, I don't want to hear this because my day has been the exact opposite. I've absolutely failed to do, well, that's not true. I've had loads of admin that has taken up loads of time, but I've failed to do any of the big things that I wanted to do today. So you're going to have to, I'm going to have to kind of get your mindset on for Monday, I think, to turn things around.
But do you know what? It was only this morning I was like, I know what I can do. I can chuck my shorts and vest into my bag and then I can go straight to the gym. And like, why have I never done that before? Because I always wear trainers when I lecture. So yeah, that for me was like a brainwave. But I do feel a bit jealous you had an admin day, because I love an admin day. I love sorting stuff out.
Yeah, I needed it. It was all those things that had kind of just crept over from the rest of my week that just hadn't been dealt with, that needed to be dealt with. But it does bring me very nicely to my win of the week, because one of them is I was sending an invoice and I wasn't sure on the final amount because the feature had ended up being kind of a bigger thing than we'd originally settled on. And I was going backwards and forwards with loads of edits and questions, and it had taken more work. And I thought, am I going to have to mention this? Do we have to kind of say this? So I went back and said, we do it sort of on a word count thing. So I went back and said, I remember, I haven't sent an invoice for this. What's the final amount? Sort of thing, hoping that they would up it. And actually, it was £300 more than we'd originally agreed or had originally accounted for. So let's introduce our guests who both do public speaking alongside their journalism work.
Today, we have with us Dhruti Shah, a freelance journalist, writer, and all-round ideas factory. Dhruti wrote and produced stories for a global audience when she was working for the BBC, and since going freelance has written for The Guardian, Washington Post, New Humanist, The Lead and more. She is also available for hosting and presenting work, and does inspirational talks about resilience and overcoming obstacles. She has also moderated discussion panels and workshops.
And we also have with us today Hannah Ajala, a journalist who specialises in producing podcasts. You may have heard her award-winning 7-part true crime series, Love, Janessa. I know I was definitely hooked on that one. Hannah also offers a range of services around consultancy, writing and hosting, and public speaking, having given over talks at 30 different organisations. This includes a TEDx talk, which we are definitely going to ask more about. So hello to both of you. Thanks so much for joining. I think we should probably start by asking you to tell us a little bit more about yourselves, how you got into journalism and the sort of different portfolio you have now as a freelance. Dhruti, let's start with you.
Right, so I got into journalism as a kid, proper old school. I was working for the local paper, and when I was at uni, I was doing student journalism. I wrote a column for the local paper because I went to a very fancy university because I thought that's the way to get into it when you've got no connections. Hopefully things have changed nowadays, but eventually I ended up at the Harrow and Wembley Observer. I got a bursary. I did my training on the job. It was a fast track scheme run by Trinity Mirror and PA Training. So exams, the whole caboodle. And then digital took over. So, by the time I was chief reporter, it's time to make a move. And that's when I ended up at the BBC. 14 years I spent there, was a trainee. And by the time I'd left, I'd had many fingers in many pies. So working at Panorama, doing investigations, working on the website, went to Washington as a social news writer, doing business, BBC business. So lots and lots of different things, working especially in user-generated content. Now, since I've gone freelance, it's been about 2 and a bit years. I tend to do actually less of the journalism. So that doesn't form the key part of my income portfolio. Speaking is quite significant, but I do write stories often at equity at heart. For me, that's a really key thing when it comes to being able to get those stories out there. So I do coaching, relational dynamics coaching for creatives, podcasting, the speaking gigs, corporate work, still the journalism, copywriting, mentoring, storytelling workshops. You end up becoming that jack of all trades, but also a master of all trades as well. So,
yeah, it's really interesting. You've got that great diversity there, and yet you've kind of come from this grounding in journalism, and it just shows you like how many transferable skills there are. Hannah, I'd like to bring you in here then. Could you tell us a bit more about your background and kind of how that's progressed and your sort of freelance portfolio now?
So I definitely say my journey into freelancing was without me even using the term. I think it was more for creative direction after working full-time at the BBC for close to a decade now. So when I started, I was on a graduate trainee scheme, and that's all thanks to Creative Access, who are incredible. And midway through that 1-year trainee scheme, I was so proactive with connecting with as many people as possible because I just wanted to dip my toes in different ponds. So a lot of my background was working on the Jeremy Vine show, to working with Claudia Winkleman, to Chris Evans when he was on his breakfast. And then I think shortly after the trainee scheme, I wanted to just branch into like more digital ways of storytelling. And that's how I was able to obtain contracts for the long term with, long form audio or trending or international programs that broadcast to younger audiences, and then going into long form when I wanted to work on like more podcasts, which led me to working in podcasts eventually. And I found just before I freelanced, I was working in day-to-day breaking news, which can often be quite depressing when you're regurgitating information that is just awful, especially when you're reporting on parts of the world that naturally have a negative headlines and connotations attached to it, especially in the mainstream media lens. So me wanting to freelance, I guess, was a way of just tapping into different audiences and challenging stereotypes. So after those 5 years of full-time work, I had to sit down with my editor and I said, I want to travel and I want to work on engaging stories about amazing people. And she said, Hannah, it sounds like you want to freelance. And I said, is that what it's called? Let's give it a go.
Excellent. I love that. I love that you both have so many strings to your bow as well, because I think that's something that Lily and I have always kind of championed in kind of using those skills in different ways. But Dhruti, let's get on to the public speaking. Tell us about how you got into this in the first place. Was this something that you were asked to do, or was this like a type of work that you'd actively sought out? How did that get started for you?
It ended up being an actual natural progression. So I am a writer. If anyone asks what is it that you do? What's in your heart? What's driven you? I'd have to say it's always writing. I'm more comfortable writing. I prefer it. So I had to train myself to become comfortable with the public speaking. But you can't get away from it. Especially nowadays, I don't think you can be like, I'm only going to do this, I'm only going to do that, because you have to be able to sort of share the stories in a multi-platform way. You have to be able to advocate for your stories as well. So that public speaking pathway actually came from writing and then being asked to go on radio, go on TV. I mean, I remember my first sort of live two-way on TV. I was like, what on earth am I doing? This is not my natural home. But it was like, get on there, talk the way that you talk anyway. And I think that's also something for the public speaking. I can switch. I do code switch. I can code switch. Like I can go completely posh. But right now, I'm a much better public speaker when I just talk the way that I'm speaking to you now. But it's taken me a long time to get back into that, my Hayes voice, as it were. But people would ask me about stories. You know, I'm case study in social mobility, and you know, being that minority in journalism, for me, the older I got, the more experienced I got, the more I realized it's really important for people like us to be visible, to take on those public speaking gigs, to be able to talk on a variety of subjects, because other people are doing it. So why can't we do it? And, you know, when I became freelance, when I made that choice, it made sense to maintain that, because who's going to sponsor me? Me. I applied for speaking agencies. I actually applied to try and get an agent. I didn't get one. So to be honest, all of my speaking gigs, and, you know, happy to talk further on that, have been negotiated by me. Like, I'm on databases, but there is that whole element of being an advocate and being able to say, this is my story for the record books. I want to be the one who's able to take that narrative that I've researched, that I've been able to put forward. And if it's not me, it's going to be the content. It's going to be those who are within the story. So in terms of the public speaking, I never set out when I was a kid to be like, I'm going to be a public speaker, I'm going to be a broadcaster. I set out to be a writer. But nowadays, I take that and I take it with confidence that I am a public speaker, a keynote speaker, a moderator, a facilitator, all of that, because I have to do. But it has taken a long time to get comfortable with that uncomfortable.
Yeah, I'm totally with you with that. I couldn't see myself like as a public speaker, but it's interesting that you said you had to train yourself. And I guess when we all started out in journalism, you know, we had that training, that grounding, and now it's, you know, automatic. So it makes complete sense that you have to kind of teach yourself how to do it. So that's really interesting, and the fact that, again, you haven't got an agent and you're doing it yourself, and that kind of ties in quite well with other stuff we've talked about publishing as well. You know, you don't always have to have an agent. Hannah, how has it sort of developed for you then? Has there been a catalyst, a particular piece of work? You know, your podcast was, you know, really successful. Is that where it started, or were you already doing it?
I would say it started at around 2017/2018 with public speaking. So I was someone that likes to be quite proactive with social media. I know there's millions of apps and so much scrolling and etc. But I find that in an industry like journalism, media and public speaking, it works as a really great creative outlet and almost like a digital portfolio for people to have an idea of what you're like before physically meeting you. So I think, I mean, it was quite a big one for a first one, but it was my TEDx talk. And my goodness, I think it was just all about speaking things into existence. I had a busy working day. This is when I was full-time at the BBC, and I tweeted and I said, I'm going to do a TEDx before the age of 30, and that somehow happened before the age of 25. And I would definitely say I was quite new to it. And I had amazing assistance and help, and of course loads of resources that you can look at online to see different ways to present yourself. I think it's always important to pay attention to the audience, because you could speak to anyone from any different background or walk of life, and just making sure that your message that you have to share is very clear and concise. And mine was about positive delusion. You know, the fact that whatever kind of barrier that societal pressures try to place upon you, you can really break that glass ceiling. And those are some messages that I take with me now. And I definitely, I'm a big believer in growth. If I look back at the TEDx and, over 5 or 6 years later, just seeing the differences of my skills, like I think probably from then till now, I've probably lost count of how many public speaking engagements I've had. And last year was such an eventful year. I think I did 16 speaking engagements and got married. So those were 2 big centers of attention. I think that the funny thing about being a journalist or a storyteller or even working in news, people immediately assume that you can talk in front of people for days. But I honestly think it takes a certain level of training, especially when people are looking at you all the time, like at my wedding or when you're at a stage, or if you're speaking in front of thousands of people, or even with the live event, you can see hundreds of people have tuned in. But I would definitely say it's a journey, and with each and every speaking engagement, you always want to be better. You always want to give yourself bits of feedback, but of course, don't be too hard on yourself, because at the end of the day, no matter how many times you're used to it, it's still quite a courageous thing to do. Speaking in front of strangers and gathering their attention, and hopefully walking away with a key message or takeaway from what you've presented to them.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree that confidence builds over time, because I started out as a print journalist, never did any speaking. I worked at the BBC for a bit as an online journalist, and it was at that period at the BBC where they were trying to make everybody do everything, so that you were getting trained in radio and trained in TV, and you were going to produce the same story across all these different things. And I was really young, I was in my 20s, and this just sent me into an absolute panic, fear spiral. I just did not want to kind of have that kind of platform, I suppose. Cut to now, many years later, and I do lots of public speaking in different ways. I've kind of been on podcasts, I've been on radio programs talking about my stories that I've written. I was kind of the media contact go-to for a campaign that I was working on for a long time. I've been asked to speak at conferences. And I definitely would not have that same level of panic now. I think I would back myself and just think, you have this level of experience, you can do this, you've done this before. But how much, I'm going to ask this to both of you actually, but how much do you feel, how much preparation do you do, I suppose? How much of that confidence comes from knowing exactly whatever it might be, exactly what that kind of public speaking engagement is, how that's going to go, being clear about what you're going to say and what your message is. Hannah, what about you? Kind of how much preparation do you do?
I think it definitely depends on how meticulous the topic is. And just, because some things can be very detailed. So the podcast that I presented, it covers many layers that you don't talk about in the everyday. We're talking about romance scamming and fraud and online dating and even bits of witchcraft. So I find that when you're presenting it to an audience that have never heard anything about this, I think definitely researching the points that you're going to make to translate to them better, because I'm coming in, I guess, as the expert that knows this in and out. But how do I present it to people that have heard it for the first time? And I guess when you're talking to certain brands or organizations that specialize in something, you definitely want to research elements of what they do and that how that kind of ties in with what you do and how you can bring to it as well, just so that it's that understanding that I've come from one place, you've come from another, and this is why I'm here. This is how we can relate on this particular topic. And I'm a very big believer in wanting to also get the audience involved as well. Quite a lot of panels, they can be a bit tricky sometimes because it's just got that formula, isn't it? Like people are sitting on a high chair and they're talking to the attendees and it's back and forth and a Q&A. So I do try my best to be interactive, ask people, put their hands up, and etc. But I would definitely say having some key bullet points, being quite relaxed with it as well. and not over rehearsing too much, because I think there's a key reason as to why people invite you for this, because they want you, not the robot you or the, overly perfectionist you, but you in your simplest but of course best form to engage and, really let people leave thinking, wow, I've learned a thing or two. And yeah, it's just enlightening them with more information in regards to what you're speaking about.
Absolutely. Dhruti, how much preparation do you do? Because I always feel I have actually said no to being like a talking head on the radio or something when it's a topic that I haven't actually reported on. I don't feel comfortable just going to speak about anything. I would want to make sure that I was knowledgeable about it. So yeah, what does your preparation look like?
My reputation is someone who adds value. So in terms of the prep work, I'm completely with you in that respect. I have never actually gone into something without being prepped. And by that, even in terms of, I went out of my way in the last couple of years to go for improv lessons. And that forms part of my preparation, that if I'm in a live situation and it's straight away, quick, you've got to start talking about this, or I've got to bounce off subject matter, especially like, Hannah was talking about the moderation, the facilitation. People, they are the experts. We're not the experts. We're there to facilitate and be conduits. The improv has been an amazing, helpful tip and a helpful training ground to tap into my parts of the brain that can bounce. That is just Dhruti, who likes to be curious and find out more about these people and have a bit of a laugh as well as take something super serious. So I form that as part of my prep, that I'm able to do that in situations where I'm not as comfortable. But honestly, I will prep as much as I can, but again, without being too over rehearsed. That point, I think it's the rule of 3, is something that I very heavily think is something that helps me push forward. So, do I have the 3 points in terms of that? I need to make sure the takeaway for the audience. So even if we're going into a different direction, those 3 points, we know that the audience is definitely going to leave this podcast with, this speaking gig, this corporate gig, this journalistic gig with. For me, having that as a basis is really, really helpful. Honestly, I think the more experience you get, the more easier it is to be in those situations of believing in your own ability to have that prep somewhere, to have something you can pick up on in the back of your mind. But I am actually with you, Emma. I've actually turned stuff down, or I've flagged up a different speaker who I think is more qualified to speak on that particular subject. And I think, Hannah, we would definitely agree on this. For me, it's about being part of cohorts and about amplifying others as well, and especially underrepresented voices. So for me, if I'm not the right person, or I think actually here is a stronger voice on this, I would actually put them forward, because I believe in seeding, and I believe that it does also come back, even as a freelancer as well, that it comes back. Maybe I'll lose out on that gig, but I know that person will then put me forward for other gigs where I'm potentially a better speaker in respect to the subject matter. So lots of prep, and prep doesn't necessarily mean content. Sometimes it means technique.
That's really interesting, and that the fact you've had that improv training as well, which again totally makes sense, because I guess quite often you're kind of being put on the spot, or you want to react to your audience as well. It'd be good though to find out a bit more detail about what you actually talk about, and how does that work in terms of a brief? Does someone sort of say, very specifically, can you talk about X? Or is it more, come and speak at our event, tell us what you'd like to talk about? How does that part of it work? Hannah, but what's the process for you?
I think it goes back to the organization. So some will just say flat out, like, your podcast was amazing. Talk to us about the process of making it. Boom. And you don't hear from them until the day of the event, where they say, good to go. And then others, I find that there's a little bit of hand-holding, where maybe they want to have a meeting with you beforehand just to talk through the structure of it. And then maybe like a final run through. Some can be quite meticulous with timing as well, meaning that you get a specific type of slot. And then I also really appreciate people that give me creative freedom to have a think, have a little bit of research, and go back to them and say, okay, these are some of the points that I want to cover. Let me know what you think. Typically, they'll either reply and say, that's brilliant, Hannah, or they may even add some comments or some tweaks. I'm always a very big welcomer of feedback and suggestions. So I've definitely understood that people work in different ways, but I do appreciate collaborative efforts being made. And, you know, I do also understand that people are sometimes too busy to develop things in the way that they would. And I guess that they trust that I'll do my job well and not show up and start rapping or singing or doing the complete opposite of what I've been asked to do. So I find that it's a combination, but often it's always really positive. And I'm a very big ideas person. And, you know, as well as collaborating with people and hearing their take on things, I'm also very appreciative and humbled by people that just welcome the ideas that I have and choose that as the structure.
Yeah, how did that work with the TEDx talk? Was that one of those collaborative processes where you kind of decided together what that talk was going to look like?
Yeah, absolutely. Parts of it almost felt like my dissertation. Because, you know, I would make a copy, I would send it for feedback, and there'd be quite a few corrections, and then back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. But I found that, you know, it was really important because that's like a very kind of like, I don't want to say iconic, that sounds cringe. It's a very big privilege to be on such a platform like that. And platforms like that live there for a very long time. People may discover it 2, 5, 10, 20 years from now. So I don't think it's necessarily about being perfect, because I do believe if you wait for perfect conditions, you'll never be ready. But I think it's just really doing the best that you can so you're at least happy and confident with the results that you're going to present to people. So there were a few back and forths in a good way. And, you know, the amazing young woman that helped me with it is someone who I still speak to now and is an author now. And I really trusted her judgment. I think, you know, some people can be a little bit sensitive with their work, like, oh, why has so much of this been corrected, and why are there so many red crossings and etc. But I took it as like, wow, you know what? This is my first time doing this on such a massive global scale. And I do appreciate the hand holding. So I've always been a big believer in teamwork makes the dream work, and trusting that it's in good faith that whatever feedback I get is because they genuinely want me to do better.
Yeah. And it's great when you get feedback, isn't it? Because it shows that they care and they're passionate about it. And Dhruti, what's it like for you? Do you kind of have a list of topics you'll speak to and that you might do variations of, or is it always something completely different?
I seem to have been building a reputation as a generalist specialist.
Yeah.
So this seems to be the feedback that's coming back to me. So clearly a generalist, as you know, my training for many, many years, for like 20 odd years, under 20 odd years, there's a news journalist. So that means you've got to be able to put your hand pretty much to everything and anything. I come from a disinformation and misinformation breaking background, as it were, so investigation. So that I can talk about. And I did a lot of talking about that for quite a long time, and people still come to me, which then falls into the element of trust and safety. So that's been really interesting. But then, especially in my freelance life, I've been asked to talk about things like being Asian, the fact that I seem to have a reputation as someone who's interested in the environment, like we all are. How can we look at underrepresented people in the environment, being working class, going up and down the social mobility ladder, breaking those glass ceilings, resilience, trauma, because I have a trauma storytelling background and several fellowships in that. The overall experience of being a minority in journalism, because, you know, as I've worked in disinformation and misinformation, the digital beat. Very recently, I was diagnosed with autism. So now it's that element of neurodivergence and neurodiversity and how you build that. And so all of these intersectional elements. But I also get asked to, you never know what story's going to hit. So you might write something. So I wrote something, I found one of my first Guardian pieces about being a hairy woman and about having super hairy legs in the pandemic, and just, you know, understanding my relationship with that and my obsession with wolves. And then I got invited by Story Collider, which is a science podcast, a science comedy podcast, to write a monologue and to deliver that on stage. So that was a public speaking gig I was not expecting. And so I've never written a comedy monologue about being a hairy woman before. And I had to, and deliver it on stage in 10 minutes without my notes. So memorizing as well. And so that was coming from a piece that I was like, I just would like to write about this. It was a particular series in The Guardian. That's done and dusted. So I wasn't expecting a speaking gig, a paid speaking gig actually. And that was also then a podcast. So, it becomes a triple hit, as it were, to emerge from that. So sometimes I'll write something because I feel like it's hitting the zeitgeist, or it's something that I want to get out there. Again, I wrote a piece about not belonging, feeling that, idea of not belonging anywhere. And that went super viral. And I got speaking gigs off the back of that. Again, not expecting that to emerge, because I thought, okay, people want me to talk about the diversity thing, or people want to talk about the 20 years in journalism. And in fact, what seems to be happening is that people are bringing me on board. If they're not asking me to be keynotes, they're bringing me on board because of the substance of the journalism, but also because I'm able to facilitate conversations which highlight others. And that is not necessarily something that everybody can do. And somehow it's something I can do. And I wish I could say, this is the key to do it, because I can't say that. But I can say, I believe it's down to being more confident and about wanting stories to be told in the best way possible, which is what we as journalists generally want to do. So that earlier we talked about transferable skills. I think that has fallen into my public speaking skill set, is just being the best effective storyteller that I can be, whatever the subject matter that I either put forward in collaboration or is requested of me. Again, very recently, I seem to be building a reputation as a pain specialist. Because we're women of color, we have pain, but I'm willing to talk about pain. And organizations are coming to me saying, can you facilitate conversations around people's relationships with pain? So that's something that I wasn't expecting, but yet seems to be emerging. And again, it's so vast. I think there's definitely a lot more that I can do within that sphere. So yeah, it's a mixture. People coming to me and me taking ownership of the stories that I want to be involved with and put out there. One thing I actually just want to sort of say, and this I think is really important, is about this time last year, I was unemployed. I had no work. It was super, super quiet. Nothing was going on. And for someone who's a tech specialist, sometimes there are bits that I'm scared of when it comes to tech. I think I'm going to break the internet, or I'm going to break something. It is what it is. And I learned how to do podcasts. I learned to create my own podcast because I just wanted to connect with people. I was so super lonely. Off the back of doing something and taking that step and that action, because that was pure storytelling, telling other people's stories, connecting with super cool people that I already knew and being like, why aren't people telling your stories when they should be told? But off the back of that led to public speaking gigs, and that led to podcasting gigs, and that led to commercial gigs, and that led to more journalism. So sometimes it's often about taking the first step in something in order to be able to then tell the world, do you know what? I'm here. And going back to that subject of what can I do? Hey, I can do anything. I'm here. So come to me.
Yes. We talk about this all the time. It's such a kind of circular economy in freelancing, where you do something that then leads to something else, that leads to something else, that leads to something else. I suppose it's just about being open to those opportunities when they come along, being flexible, kind of going down different paths that you didn't think that you would be going down, or kind of hadn't envisaged your career, being part of your career. I think for some people who might be considering public speaking, there might still be a confidence barrier. And I don't know if my next question is going to make this better or worse, because I'm going to ask you, have you ever had sort of any bad, embarrassing moments? If so, how did you deal with it? Hannah, what about you? Have you had anything that you thought, oh no?
Oh, thankfully not. I did see a funny TikTok last night of a woman who was about to present a keynote for an hour, and in the first 30 seconds her chair broke and she fell down, and there was like thousands of people watching her. So I think of what I would do in that situation, but she handled it with so much grace. And I think to anyone, that is a bit nervous about tripping up or anything, I think it's just how you kind of like carry and redeem yourself after. I think one semi-embarrassing thing, it wasn't a public speaking engagement, but it was in the middle of a podcast recording for Love Janessa, and I was interviewing two crucial key guests. So there's four of us on it. We're all at completely different time zones: Italy, New York, Canada, and me in London. And there was a point where my producer in Canada was speaking to the both of them, and I could have sworn I put myself on mute. And I proceeded to shout loudly to a family member or someone who was around. And it was slightly mortifying because they completely stopped what they were doing. And I just apologized. But you know what? Again, that's another thing that kind of is that distinction between online and in person. The likelihood of that happening in person is very slim. I mean, I just wouldn't pick up my phone, for example. But I think, some of these things can be forgiven, especially with how different ways of working is now. Like, prior to the pandemic, I think I'd only ever used Zoom once or twice, but it's the complete norm. So I think it's just the understanding and hoping people do understand that, these errors are common. Like BBC Dad, for example, absolutely epic. He just tweeted the other day about that embarrassing moment that happened. So it does happen.
And I think everybody, I mean, that was obviously before we all got kind of used to Zoom and things, but I think everybody does feel that. I've had toddlers come and interrupt me and kind of shout poo up the stairs as I'm like on a really important phone call interviewing someone. I think when those things happen to you, I suppose it's just about rolling with it, letting everybody in on the joke, acknowledging that it's happening, and you do kind of get more used to that. I was once doing a lecture and all the lights went off in the lecture theatre, just in the dark. You kind of, when I'd started out kind of teaching, that would have been mortifying, but I was just kind of, you just kind of make a joke with it and you roll with it. Dhruti, have you had anything that...
I'm going to go to my rule of three. So very quick. So the first one, so I have a book. It's called Bear Markets and Beyond. I got a speaking gig, right? I'm hoping, it seems to be every author's gone through. I've decided every author goes through it. I got a speaking gig. It didn't get advertised very well. It was one of those ones. And I turned up. I think I was like a last minute slot. They were like, oh shoot, we should definitely get her involved because it's like a community thing, etc. And she's reached out and she's part of our community. There was one person. One person, and my family, thank God for my family, set up. One person came to hear me talk about financial literacy in nature, even though, this book is amazing, it's one of Wood's, whatever. One elderly woman. I blessed that elderly woman. And you know what? I treated her the same as I treated everybody else. And I thought, you know what? We'll take this as an intimate. She has made an effort to sit down and come and listen to me talk about my book. And that was slightly embarrassing. But I thought, actually, what a privilege that somebody's actually come and sit and is still willing to listen and is interested, even though it wasn't advertised, it wasn't given the same amount of advertising as perhaps other people, etc. So for me, that was slightly embarrassing, but also it made me realise it's a privilege to even have an audience of one. And then a second event that happened, and it taught me a real lesson with my podcast, actually. This was the first guest I'd ever got for my podcast. It's called Have You Thought About? And it was someone I found on Twitter before Twitter or X or whatever it is became a hot mess, and someone I really admired. And I just wanted to chat to them, just, when you want not become friends, but you just are like, I think you're super cool. And I hadn't had a proper podcast idea at that point. And, they came on board, absolutely amazing person, conservation biologist. And I just said, do you mind if I record this? Like, I have an idea. It's not even fully formed. Have you thought, And they went, yeah, okay. First time I'd ever spoken to them in real life, in Zoom life. Here's a lesson for anyone. So I was just recording it in my bedroom, etc. And this was, in terms of time zones, this was when the light was dipping. So, because I'd had the window open, I could not put it out. It could not be a video podcast because at the beginning of it, it's light. At the end of it, I'm sitting in the darkness like some sort of vampire or whatever. Like, my contributor, Gabby, who is absolutely amazing conservation biologist, was just like laughing because it was ridiculous. It was a ridiculous situation that I'd be like, I don't know you. Let's become friends. Can I just find out so much about you? And then slowly, they're watching me, and it's just lighter, you can't even see me in the video whatsoever. So that was a really valuable lesson in terms of technique. And then thirdly, and I think this is actually really important in terms of just slightly veering away from the comedy, but as a woman of colour, it doesn't matter what I do. If I'm going to be on TV, if I am going to have a clip put out of me speaking on social media, I have to factor in I'm going to get abuse. I have to factor in that whatever it is that I represent, whatever I'm saying, there are going to be a significant proportion of people not even listening, and that I will be abused. I even appeared on The Chase. Can you believe this? A game show. I was expecting abuse with that because I'm like, hey, this is comedy and this is ridiculous. But I've come to I've come to accept that if I am going out in a public speaking environment, which will then appear on social media platforms, I have to make sure that I have techniques in place to make sure that my own mental health is protected because of what other people believe that I represent. And I'm sure, Hannah, you can talk further on that as well, because that is something we do have to consider, especially in a public speaking environment.
Yeah, Hannah, is that something you've experienced as well? And how do you handle that?
Yeah, I think no reading comments definitely helps, because I think that's another thing that we can be subject to. It could be anything from speaking about diversity and inclusion, which I do as the founder of a community supporting and uplifting Black journalists. Yeah, the internet can be a scary place. And, we're seeing in recent news with one of the longest serving Black MPs in British politics who's being ridiculed right now just for existing. So there is that thing that we have to unfortunately keep in mind, that there are loads of people with nasty opinions that aren't afraid to share that publicly. But at the same time, everyone's experiences are different, but at the same time, I will never stop speaking my truth. And I'm very thankful for being in a curative space where there are other people like me, where I feel seen. I've been following Dhruti for a while now and absolutely love your work. So it's just great to be connected in these circles. And that's a decision that I've had to make, especially for mental health. I completely understand why people are not on the internet but do public speaking, because they probably can't bear some of the nasty opinions that would be shared out there. But I'm very glad to be part of collectives and communities and little villages of people that are, championing me and always shouting in my corner, people that I've not even met in person yet. And I guess that's one of the beautiful things about the internet, and definitely the side that I want to stay on, because there is another side of it that's very awful, especially to women like myself. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose we kind of often touch on the abuse that journalists, female journalists, journalists of colour can get online, but actually what we don't talk about, and what does definitely happen, and this has happened to me, is when you have those other champions who are kind of lifting you up and dealing with that on your behalf. That's something that is very positive. Dhruti, for those who are kind of thinking, right, you're making this sound great, both of you, I want to go into public speaking, how should they go about finding opportunities? Where are they going to find that work?
Tell people. You're not going to find people unless you tell people. Say, I am a public speaker. We are still in search engine optimization time. So make sure that you have a website, a portfolio site where actually it's you can be discovered. A lot of my speaking gigs, I will put something out on LinkedIn. I'm very active on the LinkedIn. I'll put something out, and then what will happen is it won't come via LinkedIn or that particular platform or another social platform, because I have a website, portfolio website, which I put everything on. They will then message me via that website after they've done a little bit of after they've basically investigated who is this person, especially if they're strangers to me, they're new to me. And then I get a message through the contact form saying, hi, we're interested in finding out more information about you. Can we have a discovery call? I didn't even know what a discovery call was. I thought it was just a call until I started public speaking. And then we'll do that. So really tell people that that's what that you're available, that you can do this. Make sure that when you're speaking to people, and you're negotiating contracts, also make sure that, what are the fees involved? If you're negotiating contracts, what is the usage? Is it a one-off? Is it licensing? Is it something that's going to be recorded for a long time? How is that going to be used? double check your contracts. I've had some very interesting clauses in my contracts before, so do get them looked through. The NUJ, if you're a member of the NUJ, they can look through your contracts as well as a freelancer, so do take advantage of those things. And also talk to other people as well, so don't just do it in isolation. So definitely tell people you're available. Definitely make sure you're aware of what help there is to help you decode those public speaking engagements. Make sure you know your worth, do figure that out, and where you're going to do pro bono stuff, because we all do some pro bono stuff because that's just the nature of the game, but where you're not going to do pro bono stuff either. Those are some of the key things that I've learned by putting myself out there. And also tell your connections generally, because they might not realize. So, tell your friends, actually make sure that if you're in these corporate environments, whatever, that I'm around, that I exist, and these are the subjects that I talk about. So don't be don't have any shame when it comes to telling people you're available to talk. Give yourself that voice, because otherwise no one will know that you're around.
Yeah, it's so true, actually. I'm just thinking back now, last year there was there's a running festival to me locally, and they always have speakers, and I remember years ago going, one day I'd like to be up on that stage giving a speech about something that I've done. And I last year had a big race that I was doing that I thought that was abroad that I thought would be of interest. So I just contacted the organisers and said, hey, are you looking for any speakers? I'd be happy to do it. This is what I'm going to be doing. This is what I can talk about. And they came back and said, yes, please. So yeah, it is very much, I guess, about putting yourself out there as well, and just identifying those opportunities. It's interesting there as well, you're talking about contracts and knowing your worth. Hannah, I wonder if we could bring you in here, just kind of on a final question, really, about how do you kind of negotiate with fees? Do you have set rates that you refer to, and how do you kind of work that out?
Yeah, it's quite funny because I was literally having a conversation about it with a friend a few hours ago. Yeah, it can be quite tricky. And, honestly, I just think of how a man would approach money and pay in comparison to me. I have heard about the most unqualified man step into a place and say, this is what I want, this is how I want it, full stop. Whereas a woman who has more experience, is more established, more talented, will beat around the bush and really dilly-dally. So I'm learning. I really am. I think last year was very eventful for me because I had 16 speaking engagements globally, big organizations, smaller organizations, you name it. And that was definitely a great way to get used to not necessarily asking, but letting them know, okay, I've done a bit of research on your organization, and I would like to consider X, Y, and Z. Always try and find some wiggle room. And I think, I do understand the importance of a woman's worth. That's point blank. But I think we also owe it to ourselves as speakers to show that we know a bit more about this organization. We're not just going in it for the money, but we're actually letting you know how we can add. And I'm sure that organization had seen that, hence why they've approached us about it. But I think definitely being more clear, and it's just so important, especially at a time where with gender pay gaps. Like a friend of mine just told me last week, the organization she's been working for 3 years, a male colleague who just joined is earning nearly 10K more a year than her. Like, she just found that out. It's still happening. So I think the more transparency we have about money, the better. So I would definitely say I've improved in comparison to last year. I think just building a safe rapport. And I never want to look back and think, oh, I should have, I could have. At that point, don't ever hesitate to have that communication and hope that the person on the other end would understand that, hence them approaching you in the first place. There's never any harm in asking or negotiating. But one day I will have a formula and a set rate. But for now, I'm just really glad that I never have to look back and think I should have or I could have, or I was too afraid to.
Yeah, if you don't ask, you don't get. And like Dhruti said as well, there are different organisations, there are different levels. They're going to have different budgets. Sometimes you will accept that kind of pro bono work because, it's a tiny charity or an issue that you really care about. So it's just kind of weighing up what you think, you know, it's your personal red lines. We've done previous podcast episodes on negotiation, and it's kind of just the same, whatever type of work you're doing. So thank you both so much for so much really, really excellent tips and insight. And before we sign off, we want to get your recommendation of a piece of work from a freelance journalist so we can share a bit of the freelance love around. Dhruti, who are you going to recommend for us this week?
So speaking, I'm actually going to go for the F-rated podcast by Hannah Ajala and Holly Tarquini. It's a feminist film podcast, so it's pretty cool. So there you go.
Lovely, excellent. That sounds fantastic. We will add the link to that in our show notes. Hannah, what about you? What's your recommendation?
I recommend the latest book, which just came out March 2024 by Jason Okundaye. He's an amazing freelance journalist. His book is called Revolutionary Acts, Love and Brotherhood in Black Gay Britain. You know, one of the most gripping articles he had written by The Guardian was the moment he found out his father had died and he had to rush to the hospital to go and see him. But in the midst of that rush, he had bright red painted nails and was trying to remove it before actually going in there and you know, being confronted with that reality of identity and, you know, what it's like to be from a marginalized community and also LGBTQ plus. So amazing writer. He writes about all sorts, and yeah, I can tell that it's a really great year for him.
Fantastic. That sounds like a really good read. I'm going to go and dig that out. And yeah, like Emma said, we'll add that to our show notes. Well, once again, thank you both so much. It's been absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure our listeners will have got plenty from today's episode. But that's it for this week. Anyone like to ask Emma and I to do public speaking? We're always available. But you can find out more about us at freelancingforjournalists.com, and you can also sign up to our Substack, where we have a weekly newsletter as well as additional podcast episodes. But for now, we're going to say goodbye until the next series. So goodbye for now.
Yep, goodbye.